So it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ruth Steiner. Ruth is a professor and director of Center for Health and the Built Environment at the University of Florida, where her research focuses on coordination of transportation and land use. Her particular focus is on planning for all modes of transportation, its impact on communities, the environment, and public health. She has experience working with states and local governments on school site selection and policy. Ruth is also the principal investigator for a Florida Department of Transportation research project focused on multimodal transportation planning around schools. And besides all that, she knows her football. So here she is. Join me in welcoming. Thank you.
So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of school policies around school siting, the benefits of doing it right, some of the policies and programs and how we can do it, and then really look a little bit at value. I have a case study in North Carolina and Florida where we looked at newly sited schools and created some opportunities to talk about the value associated with having more children living near schools. What are the costs associated with when we think about building a school? We have to think about the fact that that school is a long-term community asset. And yet it's surrounded by neighborhoods that are ever changing. Some of those neighborhoods are quite stable. Families move in. They have children. Initially, there's lots of elementary schools, then there's middle school children, then there's high school students. And if the neighborhood is really stable, people might live there for 40 years. And there's a period of time where there won't be very many elementary school children or middle school children. And yet, that school has to serve the community in some way or another. And the challenge in this is understanding those cycles. In contrast, there may be neighborhoods that have constant change, where there's constantly elementary and middle school children. So understanding your local context can be quite important in thinking about the topics. And so I'm going to talk general principles, recognizing that my experience in what's happening in Florida and North Carolina, I don't live in North Carolina, I've never lived in North Carolina, but they're very different than the context here. And understanding your own context, I want to emphasize that that's very important. But as we look at this, we need to understand that there are economic reasons why we ought to be engaging in and rethinking how we manage our schools and how we manage the transportation to them. Over the past 20 years, the rate of childhood and adult obesity has been increasing at a steady and incremental rate, such that today about 1 in 3 children are overweight or obese. And the increased percentage that are obese being overweight means more than what they're supposed to be for their weight. Obese is measured by body mass index. But that currently has the latest estimates, which are a couple years old. Our direct costs are $14 million, but we recognize that children have the opportunity to develop healthy lifestyles. If they're unhealthy as children, they're more likely to, and there are starting to be studies that show that children who are overweight or obese are also more likely to have what had historically been things associated with adulthood, like heart disease, diabetes, cardiovascular, and all of those things that have long-term healthcare costs associated with them. So these are really just direct costs, but when you begin to look at the ongoing long-term costs, they're much, much higher. We've seen a decline in physical activity, and it's important to recognize that walking to school is only one part of physical activity. Physical education in schools is another part, but even just play after school and such is another part of that. But when we look at this segment of walking, of physical activity, what we realize is that we've seen a steep decline from 48% in the 1960s to only about 10% today. Complex reasons for that were more spread out, among other things. But even when we look within 1 mile of schools, which is the capture area, we've seen a decline. Notice that's 2009 data. I have more 2017 data. which shows a similar relationship, but it really shows the importance of being very close in, less than half a mile. Now the parental responsibility zones are what distance here? I always forget. It's a mile and a half.
1 mile for elementary, a mile and a half.
Oh, okay, that's right. I know I'd heard that. So you can see that there's great opportunities for many children to be walking to schools when there's lots of residences located near the schools. Addition to that is to recognize that there's significant transportation costs associated with this. And again, state regulations vary significantly, but the latest data suggests that we nationally spend almost $25 billion busing children in orange school buses. My own state of Florida spends $1 billion a year. And when you start to think about that, and that's $900 per student. And so that's some of what I'll be talking about later, is thinking about what you can do if you can be more careful about getting more children to live closer to your schools. The other cost that we see is actually the cost of congestion. I'm about to start a study comparing again Florida to North Carolina, where we look at congestion associated with schools. It's estimated to be something between 15 and 25%. Of course, different schools will have different characteristics associated with congestion. There's sort of this challenge of, do you build a school on an arterial where it's easy to get to? Or do you build it in the middle of the neighborhood where it's surrounded by residences? And if it's surrounded by residences, then are the people who live in that neighborhood going to be, they might be a little bit unhappy with the school traffic going to it in the morning. The other things to recognize is that the transportation cost, and do you know what percentage of your budget is for school transportation? Does anybody here know that?
Our transportation budget is $21 million. Our school budget last year was $505 million.
Okay.
503.
21 million. So I can't do math very quickly. Is that close enough? But you begin to say, even if you could cut that by, say, 0.2%, that probably would free up a bit of money. So that's really important to recognize. And the other reality is that 50% of children get to school by automobiles, largely because parents aren't necessarily happy with sending them on the bus even when the bus is available, and that has significant congestion impacts. The other thing to recognize is that physical activity has other other school-related benefits. That is that there's a systematic review which looks at all the studies that have been done on this. In this case, it's something like 20 studies, and about 15 of them said that physical activity improved cognitive performance and academic performance among children in schools. There's similarly a smaller number of studies on physical activity showing reduced absenteeism. More anecdotally, about a month ago, I went to a Safe Routes to School conference, and there were evidence of reduced absenteeism among students participating in walking school buses, which is a method where you pick up all the kids in the neighborhood. And so you have the community engaged in ensuring that children are attending school. So here's part of our dilemma, which is there's too much traffic for Billy to walk to school, so we drive him to school, so we increase traffic and we make it less and less safe for the children who are walking to school. So when we begin to look at the factors affecting school choice, these are sort of the ones that you can begin to, some of these you control more easily, in particular the location of the school and the location of residence. The choice about how you circulate traffic around the school can be a conscious choice of a region, and that's partly related to a connection to its highway system. And then really, even within that, many places don't have sidewalks, so walking, although I've had to amend this, I live in a house that does not have sidewalks, but there's lots of walkers, and it's because we have low volume of traffic in the neighborhood. So I think that there's those other pieces of that. But even then, the other part is getting people across the street. In recent years, we've started talking a lot about first mile, last mile access, and some of that's simply about getting somebody, like if you've got a bus stop but you can't walk to the bus stop, then you begin to ask how effective that bus system can be if you don't connect people in a multimodal manner to the transportation system. There's similar issues with schools, which is if sometimes you've got a major roadway, if you don't have a good crossing, a safe crossing, a place where you feel safe for your children to get across that street, crossing guards can help, although crossing guards entail an ongoing commitment of funds to pay for the crossing guard. And we also, the other factor that's really become important in recent years is the limits on parents' times. Many parents are dropping their children off on their way to work or other activities of the day, and so they may be choosing to do that. So the real question we have to ask as a community is, what are the combination of factors that offer the most opportunities for safe movement of children? I'm going to show a couple of schools, with my apologies to those who saw this presentation before. So this is a relatively new elementary school in Pasco County, which is north of Tampa. It's a combined middle and elementary. And you'll notice here, you can see these are multifamily housing right across from the school. So how many, and the school zone is set up so that these kids go to this elementary school. Too high, 0. What I didn't tell you, I'm tricking you, is that this is a 4-lane arterial that's a 55 speed limit, except in this zone where they aren't willing to make it into school zone. And you begin to think if you could have done an overpass, and because by the time you think about buses going back and forth, even this short distance, that, as I will show a little bit later, you could pay for that overpass in less than 5 years probably. And that is the challenge, that once you build a school, you've set it up for a whole set of system costs long term. If that school is being built for a 50-year time frame, if you build it in the wrong place or you don't connect it well enough to pedestrians' movements, you're going to incur those costs every year, year after year. Another example, this is from the Orange County, which is where Orlando's located. These households are about, 10 feet, 100 feet from the school. It takes them a mile to get to the school. And in an extreme case, this is the most extreme, with my credits to Billy Hadaway, who's the traffic manager for the city of Orlando. You have 2 houses back to back, no pedestrian path between them unless the homeowners choose to have one. How long do you think this distance is if they want to go to their neighbor? I know I don't have a scale here. How far do you think it is? And I would point out there's an elementary school right here. And similarly, these students are probably zoned for this school. So how far do you think the 70-foot distance is in driving with your car? 2 miles, anybody think it's more or less? Closer. It's 7 miles. 7 miles to go 70 feet. Now, I'll grant you there's a lot of lakes and such that create, and I know you have the challenge here of topography. So I think both of them are barriers to movement of pedestrians, and it's probably much more costly. But this, could have been handled with connectivity, street connectivity quite easily. Another example, and this comes from my own county, relatively new school with very few children living around it. This is a rural section of roadway, again, probably 55 mile, 40, maybe 45, I'm not sure, I haven't been out there lately. That widens to 4 lanes right close by, so you've got some movement here between people speeding up when they know the roadway is going to split. And they're now building subdivisions here, which will require students to cross the street, which is relatively high speed. And drivers in the area are not used to being cautious about being around schools. So I'm just realizing so this is the way that I conceptualize and think about this. And the challenge we have is that we often work in silos. We have school planning, we have land use planning that's handled by one division in the city, and then we have transportation planning. Sometimes there's coordination here because staff work together, but sometimes this is public works and this is planning and this is in the school board. And often they're funded separately. Separate streams of public monies go to all of them, but they're really things within the public realm. And the way I think about this is that combining land use and transportation planning means that you coordinate between various uses. And I'll go through each of these in detail in a moment. The second is really thinking about school coordination between the school district and the community on where schools are going to go, where we expect growth in the county, where should schools go, and things of that sort. And the third one is safe routes to school. Florida had safe ways to school before safe routes to school, and that's really coordinating transportation with school planning. So if we look at each of these, multimodal planning basically says we're looking at and trying to incorporate all modes into practice, and some of that is through land use planning. And some of it's really saying if we have places we can walk, we're more likely to walk, or bicycle, and now we have e-scooters and all sorts of other technologies that allow us to get them around. So the idea of a complementary mix of land uses is we want to have things that we're likely to go to. I can walk to a grocery store in my neighborhood without sidewalks, but I live about a half mile from a grocery store, and I occasionally do that. We also want intensities and densities of development. In the case of schools, is somewhat unique compared to other uses. Thinking about complementary land uses to schools is probably a little more difficult than thinking about it in the general community. I've been staying in downtown, and I noticed there's lots of places I can go. I've been walking around a lot, and it makes it's easy to walk there because there's places I know I'm going to go. But for schools, it's what is complementary to schools, or maybe ask the other question is what's not complementary to schools. Probably something that has a lot of trucks involved with it, that have a grocery store may not make sense near a school. While we want it near our residences, we may not want it very close to the school because they're going to have drop-off and delivery with using large trucks. But for instance, a daycare might be complementary to a school because parents can drop a child, if they have children of various ages, they could drop a child off at the school on their way to, at the daycare on their way to dropping things off at the school. So beginning to think about other kinds of land uses that are non-residential, that are complementary to the school can be helpful. After school care is another example where if you're moving children from the school to an activity after school. The other thing is creating a network that's networks for all modes. I think one of the challenges we have is that we often, and we see it in safety, which is people who don't own automobiles are going to walk because they have to get places. And so if we don't provide network connectivity, then we're going to have challenge within our community. And we really need to have a good urban design. There are sort of, as I would say, there's starting to be there's always been this distinction between utilitarian walking. I'm walking because I need to do something, so I need to pick something up at the grocery store. Or I need to go to work if I'm close enough to my work. And what is called recreational walking. And in some respects, we need to recognize that for different communities, the difference between recreational and utilitarian walking. In lower income communities where people don't own automobiles, it's much more important to plan for walking and bicycling because that's going to be a mode that people who don't drive are using. Similarly, for aging populations, we may need to, although they can't necessarily walk as far. Really, this is where we consider school location as a long-term decision of the community, and we say, what's going on around this school? How can we ensure, if we're going into a growing area, are we building the school close enough to where the population is currently? Are we creating a situation where we're building a school and then we have sprawl residential development because the school is built on the edge of the community? And are we planning to have residential locations, residences located close enough to the school so that they can use the school, or are we going to induce much more development in an area, and are we going to create traffic problems, which is the other piece of this, if we don't coordinate it well. So we're really trying to located near residential areas. And Florida, just as to mention, has experimented with something called school concurrency, where development, when new development was coming in, the developers had to ensure that they had infrastructure and facilities available concurrent with the impact of development. And over time, we had school concurrency for a 5-year period that will influence the results of what I will show in one of the research I'm showing. The third one is Safe Routes to School, which is coordination of transportation and schools. And this was a federal program, standalone program from 2005 to 2012 that initially allocated about $629 million allocated to all the states. Every state got money. Not a lot of money, but eventually, in the end, it ended up being about $1 billion. And that required that funds be used for non-infrastructure, so encouragement, education, enforcement efforts, and evaluation. And most of it, the bulk of the money, anywhere between 70 and 90% would go for infrastructure, like building overpasses, building sidewalks, building flashing beacons, things that facilitated crossing street, things of that sort. That program has since been incorporated into the broader, what's called the enhancements program. So there was also a pot of money for building trails and off-road facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians that's been in federal law since 1991. Although, again, how states handle this is very different. My home state of Florida is, in fact, continuing to fund Safe Routes to School with safety money because the idea is that, and I'm currently in the middle of an evaluation to see how effective it has been at improving safety for children who are walking around schools. The evidence actually at the moment seems to be fairly good. But it's a relatively small program, but nonetheless important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study of new schools in Florida. And these schools, what we did to do this, and I'm going to do a little bit of context, at the time we were spending a little bit less. The percentage of money spent on transportation has remained pretty stable at about 4.2%. And the minor difference is in that Florida has a 2-mile parental responsibility area, whereas North Carolina is 1.5, which means that North Carolina effectively has more children who are bused. That has implications. A lot of this is measured in a per student total. At the time, it was the annual cost of transportation. We were only about $354 per student. That has continued to increase. So we're talking 6 or 7 years old. And basically, the real issue on Safe Routes to School and school transportation is that for children walking to school, as we saw from the very beginning, is that the distance to school is the most commonly cited barrier to walking and bicycling. So the more residences you get close to the school, the greater the opportunity there is for children to walk and bicycle to school. The other thing is to recognize that we often only look at the annual busing costs, and we don't necessarily look at mode shares, because if you can shift students out of walking into walking, you can reduce your costs. You may have other safety issues, and you need to be sure you have facilities that support it. So what we did here was we looked at all of the costs associated with transportation, public costs, private costs, and external costs. Public costs were those that directly were charged to the school or the local municipality. The private costs was mostly associated with the family vehicle. And then we looked at community costs, this is what you would say, which is safety, congestion, and other environmental costs associated with driving the automobile. And then we looked at the variability. We started with all of the schools built in North Carolina and Florida from 2000, that opened between 2009 and 2012. We also wanted to look at urban schools or suburban. We didn't want to look at rural because that's a totally different situation. And there's a lot of different considerations in rural communities about how do you find a school that handles a whole school. Oh, I should step back and say our school districts are county-wide. So the decisions on, and I believe it's the same in North Carolina, although I'm pretty sure that in North Carolina, cities can opt out of the county-wide school district. And so we looked at a number of factors and ended up choosing, as I mentioned, a total of 9 schools in Florida and 11 in North Carolina. And what we begin to find very quickly is this is sort of an important factor, that in Florida, same period of time, in Florida, the density of development around schools is much higher than in North Carolina. There are some reasons for that. It's a little bit gets into, which is that Florida had required coordination in the period during which these schools, decisions about these schools were made. So, and here's examples of where these schools are. You'll notice most of these are North Florida. What was happening in that period in South Florida was that a lot of families with children were moving further north in the state because of housing affordability issues. North Carolina, you can see it's quite spread out. I don't know North Carolina as well, so I can't talk a lot about it. But these are the kind of costs we looked at, both capital cost, operations costs, and maintenance costs, and then the private costs. And we looked at external cost, although not in some of these we weren't able to quantify as much. And this was done through basically some national aggregate data, but we also then spoke to various people in the school board level, sent surveys and have them fill out a long survey with all sorts of cost items. And this is what we found when we looked at mode splits. And this again goes back to the fact that Florida schools tend to have higher density. It means that there's greater opportunities for walking and bicycling to school. Very little walking and bicycling, largely because the schools were not built at a high enough density to have enough children live close enough to the schools. And these are, although the Florida costs end up being higher, largely because of the private costs being higher, because more parents, because our parent responsibility zone is much larger. Now how do we, so when we begin to look at this, we looked at 3 different scenarios: less costly, typical, and a more costly. And this is the example of the first school. When you look here, you think there's not many schools. And there is a problem here in the sense that they did the circulation. If they had changed the circulation on the site, they might have been able to get even more children walking if they'd moved it even closer in. When you look here, you realize there's lots of residential development around it. But the distance here is a lot of the distance in which children would be walking. So you might think about whether you could swap around the site and change it to make it more efficient. But even then, we have relatively low costs. This one is sort of a typical school where we've got about fewer students who are within the 1 mile, and the costs, and this is again in Florida, you have certain numbers within it. You probably could do more, although here you can see the environmental constraints on the school site. And finally, the third one, this is one that's much more, probably the most rural school that we did in the sample. And you can see there's hardly anybody living close to the school. It's designed for everybody to drive to, although I'm not sure what's going to happen when this starts to urbanize in that area. The second thing that we did, though, with these numbers is we then said, what happens if we avoid the costs? We used the cost we calculated from this data, and then we said, recognizing that in the state of Florida, but in many states, about half states is what my recollection is, have what's called hazardous walking conditions, where they have certain criteria that says if children live in an area that has this a lot of traffic, not a good sidewalk, or not a continuous sidewalk network. They automatically qualify to be bused to school even if they live within the 2-mile parental responsibility zone. The percentages in Florida are about somewhere between about 4% of students are receiving hazardous busing conditions, and the hazardous walking, they're receiving school busing for hazardous walking conditions. And there's a real challenge with it, because if you want more children to be bused because of hazardous walking conditions, then it's more expensive to bus them because you're busing children who live relatively close. The second thing is that if you designate something as being hazardous walking condition, there's no incentive for the community to improve it. And within the state of Florida, the variability is between, there's some places that have no hazards, but there's 1 or 2 counties. Hillsborough County, which is where Tampa, has about 5% of their children being bused. And there's another county in the Panhandle where Pensacola is located, where it's, I believe it's 12% of students are being bused. So when we look at these, we took the costs from the previous study and annualized them, looked at the cost of busing within 1 mile, and then looked at different scenarios related to that, saying what happens if 92% of the children live within 1 mile versus 22%. And then we looked at sort of either none of those children are bused within 1 mile, or 50% are, or 100%. The results I'll show are with the 50%, just to show you sort of a random chance. But this is the kind of cost savings we're talking about per school in these different scenarios. And who wouldn't, per school it's $300,000, but if you multiply this across other schools, and furthermore, even take this one step further and say, what happens if you have more children who live within this mile who could walk? You can begin to understand that the opportunity for cost savings is quite substantial, related to how we think about and cite our schools. So you say, well, okay, is this real? Why would we do this? But there are a number of good examples of eliminating hazardous busing, and the estimate is about, they can reduce the cost of school transportation per child per year by the 100 to 500. But Highland Park, New Jersey is a relatively dense urban environment, relatively small community. They bused their kids to school and they decided they weren't going to, except I have to acknowledge that there are federal requirements of certain children, the exceptional, specific groups of students who have to be bused, those with physical disabilities, that they eliminated it to the extent they could, and they saved $100,000 a year just by getting rid of busing. Columbia, Missouri consolidated bus stops. This one was only a pilot project, but they created greater efficiencies, and they could reduce the amount of time their bus drivers were out on the road. They also gave children physical activity while they walked. They were a part of a national pilot project where they took 4 communities in the U.S. and did intense pedestrian treatments. And it saved money. I don't know that, I've never seen anything to show that they continued that. The city of Auburn, Washington did, Safe Routes to School did a lot of building infrastructure encouragement programs, and they saved $240,000 on an annual basis because of the investments they made in the community. And Austin, Texas simply did, we take the example I was showing earlier, and they built an overpass and saved $130,000. And if you look at that, the payback is what, 6 or 7 years? And you begin to say for a school that's been there, built there for 40 or 50 years is being quite saved. You're saving a lot of money doing that. So really the challenges, and I do not mean to trivialize the challenge of school siting, because I just went through, I was a member of a school advisory committee that made a recommendation to our superintendent on a new school to be built in our community. And the challenge we have in our community is we have the older working class part of town, minority part of town, has a very stable neighborhood, lots of home ownership, but people who are in those homes have been there for 40 or 50 years. There's very few children in the neighborhood. We are closing schools in one part of the county when we're opening on the other part of the county. And we closed a school in a small rural community that's 2,000, 3,000 in population. We closed the school there and are now busing those children to another rural community that is on the verge of being closed because it's not getting meeting the state standards. And in the state of Florida, schools that don't meet state standards after 2 years, they have to replace the principal, and then they also talk about closing the schools. So we have one vulnerable community, and that community is now having trouble attracting people to the community because there's no school. And I'm watching the east side of our community is losing all its schools at a time when the people who've owned these homes for a long time, they're affordable housing, modest owned homeowners are living there, and there's not good schools to attract people to move into those neighborhoods. So it's important. At the same time we're looking at school, we spent a couple months looking at all of the sites that met minimum criteria. We included factors like number of children within walking distance. I thought I had put it in here, but I didn't put it in my slide. But we had a lot of criteria that really, availability of infrastructure, for walking ability, safety to get there, impact on the adjacent roadway, but the number of kids who could walk. We picked a nice site. We made a decision in September. We had a school ballot initiative in November, and in the end, by the time between the end of August and November, someone purchased the school site that we had decided on, and we went to a site that's on the edge of our urban growth boundary, in a community that has very few houses at the moment, but that isn't anticipated to have very many children who can walk to the school. So, and it's well known that in rapidly growing suburban locations, it can be really difficult to find a school site because you're competing with real estate development. But the bottom line really is understanding that the connection between the school and the residential area surrounding it are really critical in determining how many children have the opportunity to walk to the schools, even in suburban locations. It's also important to recognize the private and public costs, that if you have too many parents driving their children to school, you're going to have traffic congestion associated with the school, and in some cases it can be quite severe, and you're facing lots of choices. Maybe, and I don't know the state, in the state of Florida there had been minimum size requirements, and when I talked to school, this Department of Education, they would say, oh, they're just suggestions, they're just recommendations. Except that when you looked at the local level, if you wanted to deviate from the recommendations, you had required a supermajority of the school board. So is that, how much choice is there about that, and you know better than I, some of you know better than I how difficult it can be to get a consensus on things like building a new school and such. So that's all that I have, and I'll happily take some questions. Yes?